Hi, and welcome to this introduction of the first module of the coursework Integrated Learning. What I want to do in this video introduction is to briefly introduce some of the basic theoretical perspectives on learning, communication and collaboration. I will end the presentation with also outlining the nature of the assignment for the first module. When it comes to understanding learning, the first really influential theoretical strand that we could see was when the behaviorists started to formulating ideas on how to understand learning. Their idea was that what really in detail happens in terms of learning is totally internalized into the minds of people, and therefore it could not be studied or observed. Instead, they said that what we can do is we can observe and detect traces of learning having occurred in terms of changed behavior. A very influential scholar and well-known scholar in this theoretical tradition is Pavlov and his famous experiments with dogs, where he could show that when dogs are exposed to food, they will create saliva as an autonomous reaction. But if you rang a bell, none of that reaction, of course, would happen. But during his experiments, he showed that if you kept exposing the dogs to food and bell ringing at the same time for a long period of time, the cognitive connection between bell ringing and food was reinforced into the dogs, so that after that he could simply ring the bell and observe salivation. So the concept of reinforcement is really a very central concept in behaviorism, and that also translates to educational ideas of drilling and repeating and training as a way of establishing reinforced behaviors. The learning scientist that is probably most well known, besides from Pavlov, is Skinner, but there are also a great number of other scholars who contributed to this knowledge base. And what's interesting is that we can see very clearly that the first computer systems that were designed to support learning were really very heavily influenced by the behaviorist tradition. We had systems, drilling systems labeled computer-assisted instruction, another intelligent tutoring system built on this very idea. Over time, this perspective was challenged and criticized by others, and if I oversimplify a bit, we could all kind of cluster them together under the umbrella term of constructivism. This is based on the idea that we need to know more about the cognitive processes that underlies learning. So in this strand of thinking, learning is viewed as the cognitive process of actually actively constructing understanding of singular concept, their relations, and eventually complex phenomena. If you want to illustrate that into one simple graph, it would probably be good to show you this picture of the Kolb learning styles. That illustrates how different learners have different preferred styles of learning new things. It can be a variation of concrete experience versus abstract conceptualization, learning through active experimentation versus more of a reflective observation. So if we look at this tradition of constructivism, we would find a number of well-known theoretical concepts. A central one is the idea of knowledge transfer. The idea that we can experience and learn something in one context, and then, based on cognitive process, be able to abstract that knowledge into something that could be applied in other situations. So an experience done in one context can be transferred and applied into other similar contexts. As I said, this is constructivism as a theoretical strand has many facets, and I wouldn't say that scholars such as Piaget, Dewey with his notion of learning by doing, or for that matter Kolb with his ideas on experiential learning and learning styles. I wouldn't say that they agree on every term or every aspect of learning. Quite the contrary, there are some very interesting discussions and debates among these scholars. But if we oversimplify a bit, we can see them all as members of a similar movement in learning science. It also had great impact on the way we structure, organize, and conduct education. I would say that most educational institutions, from higher education down to kindergarten, is influenced very heavily of the ideas of constructivism. Another scholar that I didn't mention in this tradition is Maria Montessori, and I'm sure you've heard of her and her ideas about how young kids, preschool age, could work with constructing new knowledge. The IT systems that arouse as a consequence of these new ideas of learning were like simulation, microworlds, and today we see a lot of interactive games, interactive multimedia, etc., etc. Eventually, also the constructivist or the cognitive constructivist ideas were challenged by anthropologists and other scientists into what we sometimes refer to as social constructivism or sociocultural theories on learning. This was all about, at the center of this critique was the challenge of the idea of knowledge transfer. That an experience made in one context is extremely difficult to transfer into other contexts. Instead, sociocultural theories really emphasize the local and situated and cultural nature of knowledge and learning. So a sociocultural scientist would say that learning is situated, it's mediated by artifacts and tools that are cultural in nature, and the social processes of meaning making and negotiation in some kind of context or practice is really central to learning. In this graph, I would say it draws very much on particularly one of the sociocultural scholars, namely Etienne Wenger, where he shows how he thinks that learning is closely related to a number of concepts and processes. Firstly, it connects to a certain context, a practice, where we would see learning as acting and doing in that context. There's also the people in the practice, the community, where learning is very much a process of having shared experiences with others, and learning then becomes a process of belonging. There's also the notion of meaning, because I mean practices and communities constantly change. So a very, very important thing closely connected to learning is the process of meaning making, negotiating meaning in new situations. And finally, Wenger and other sociocultural theorists would say that it's also closely connected to identity in general and professional identity in particular, or some kind of situational identity, where learning is also a process of becoming something. Learning to be a doctor is very much about becoming or identifying yourself as a doctor, as an example. There are a number of central concepts within this theoretical tradition and also a lot of scholars, and I will briefly mention a few to you. Lev Vygotsky is frequently put forward as kind of the father of this theoretical tradition. He was a Russian or a Soviet scientist, and among the concepts he forwarded, the zone of proximal development, the ZPD concept, is very well known. It relates to the idea that in any given situation, a learner has a zone stretching from what he already knows to what it's possible for him to know with the guidance of a more skilled peer. And yeah, that development zone is referred to as ZPD. Others, such as Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger, talks about communities of practice and legitimate peripheral participation, LPP, as a way to describe for us how learning trajectories from being a novice in the periphery of a practice takes you through a route moving into the center of the practice, where you would eventually achieve mastery or some kind of expert status within that practice. If we look at the IT tools, I wouldn't say that the social cultural theories has revolutionized the way we design IT to support learning, but one might say that it certainly emphasizes more the social dimensions. So it has put an emphasis on communication technologies, text-based, video-based, various types of collaborative authoring tools, and the fact that we often refer to learning in virtual environments as online learning communities is really a sign that we are embracing these ideas of learning as a social process. The research field of computer-supported collaborative learning, CSCL, is really a community where sociocultural theorists coexist with more cognitive constructivist, and very much of the research that is published today comes out of this field. Okay, finally over to the assignment, the way we're going to work and be assessed in this first module. What we want you to do is start thinking about a personal great learning experience, a situation where you really think you learned something in an interesting way. We then want you to think about this and try to describe it using text, images, video if you want, and enter this into a personal entry into the discussion forum on the It's Learning website. After you've done the descriptive part, we want you to comment on your own entry and add to that a theoretical analysis of this great learning experience situation, and publish also that to the forum. After that, finally, we want you to read through the entries that your course mates have entered, and at least 2 of your peers' great learning experiences should be analytically commented by each and every one of you. That way we will create an interactive discussion that is based on learning experiences that we had, each and every one of us. Okay, that was the introduction for the first module of the course. If you have any questions, comments, or want to get in contact with us, please don't hesitate to do so. Bye-bye. My name is Lars Svensson, and I'm the course examinator for this course.